The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Café. This is the United Podcast Network.
And welcome to the Writer's Block Podcast NH. I'm Deborah Monk, empowering you to find your creative voice. And today we're continuing our series of the 10 most common writing mistakes with Barb Wallace. Barb Wallace is my dear friend and is also the author of nearly 24 romance novels and mystery books. She sold her first book in 2009 and has gone on to sell nearly 1 million books in 13 countries. That still gives me the shivers. Her books have been honored and by the Booksellers Best Award, the New England Reader's Choice Awards, and the Romantic Times Book Awards. And today's show, we're going to do the second most common mistake, which we call info dumping. Barb, tell us, what is info dumping?
It is exactly what it sounds. It's when you read something and they tell you every piece of detail.
Yes.
And they dump it all out. If you did this great psychological study of your character, your protagonist, for example, and you introduce them, and then you spend the next 4 pages discussing their childhood. So when they were 3, they did this, and when they were 6, this happened, because you want to explain why they're the way they are.
Right.
And you dump it all in.
And you tell too much about setting, and you tell too much about the characters, and you tell too much about what they're feeling, and you try to tell why they're feeling it.
Exactly.
Right. And so I think, isn't it kind of difficult to figure out which parts you do need?
Yes.
Right.
I think so. I like to look at it like an iceberg.
Yeah.
Where you have this big triangle of information, and most of it should be under the surface.
Right.
You really only need at the beginning, this is the heroine, this is her problem. I keep saying heroine and hero, but this is the protagonist.
You write romance, so that's perfectly
why.
Okay.
But this is the protagonist. This is their emotional issue, and maybe why that is important. But you don't need to know how it happened, how it impacts
how they
all this
grew
stuff,
up,
how they grew up, and you certainly don't need to know how it's impacting her ability to relate to others, because that's going to be the story,
right?
Or how it scarred her, or any of that. That will come out as the story progresses. It's another good analogy would be like an onion.
Right, that you want to peel the layers off as you go
you don't
through.
You don't need the whole onion on page 1.
Because then why would you keep reading? And you wouldn't keep reading because you'd be bored out of your mind. It would just be too much information.
It would slow the book down. It bores the reader. And it gives you, there's no suspense. I mean, if you know everything.
Right.
Why would, a lot of times the book is about an internal conflict. Well, if you understand the internal conflict from the very beginning, where's the suspense?
Well, and not only that, I don't think we as people tend to understand our internal conflict all that well. I mean, therapists wouldn't be in such demand.
No. And I actually had an editor once tell me that she said, your characters are too self-aware.
Right. My characters are never too self-aware.
Well, they shouldn't be. And actually, if you think about when you meet someone in real life, would you introduce yourself? Hi, I'm Deb Monk.
I have abandonment issues, or
I have trust issues.
Right.
When I was 6, my mother,
right.
You just wouldn't go into that.
No, God,
it may come out over 20
years
years of friendship. You might drop something in like, oh, when this happened, you're like, what?
Right.
And you slowly get little pieces. Well, that's how a book should be too. And a lot of times you'll read it. I've read books where they do it with it's introspection, like they'll be combing their hair and looking in the mirror,
right,
and then reflecting for many paragraphs about something. Well, a lot of that could be revealed through dialogue or just in little
snippets,
little nuggets,
little pieces.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I did a little example for us.
Okay.
So here's an example. We start the book, let's say we're starting the book with Catherine walking down the aisle to marry Jason, her high school sweetheart. She sees her uncle in the pews, and then her aunt and her cousin Josie. And she smiles at her dentist because she invited him, but she didn't think he would come. And her grandmother's leaning heavily on her cane. Catherine wonders if her grandmother took her heart medication this morning. Do we need to know all that as she's walking down the aisle?
No.
Probably not, right?
Right.
Now, let's say Jason, the guy she's marrying, and her cousin Jody had a one-night stand last night. And the dentist is the man Catherine really wants to marry, but she thinks she's not smart enough for him, and her grandmother is going to have a heart attack within 5 minutes. Now, do we need to see those characters there? Yes, but she's not just going to notice them as she's walking down the aisle. So is this better? Since we need to see all these people. Catherine walks down the aisle in the church, staring at her rhinestone shoes. Step, pause, step, pause. She should be looking ahead to Jason standing at the end of the aisle waiting for her. Instead, she keeps peeking to her left, her dentist, who takes care of her, who would stop cleaning her teeth and actually listen to her when she talked. Was he there to steal her away? Should she go slower to be sure he could catch her before she made the biggest mistake of her life? But he smiled, so she just kept walking, doing what the 200 guests expected of her. So when the priest said, "Does anyone here have a reason these two should not be married? Speak now and forever hold your peace," Catherine looked at the dentist, and then at her grandmother, who suddenly dropped her cane, the thud reverberating through the silent church. Catherine swore her grandmother winked at her before she collapsed in the aisle.
Yes, I would like that better. Now, if I were doing it...
Yeah, tell us.
Okay, if I were doing it, I would have Catherine walking down the aisle. Jason was smiling at her, but damn if she couldn't keep looking at Dennis. Dennis the dentist. No, but I would go even deeper in her POV point of view. I would be even more so, like, I would focus on, so I would be step, pause, and there was Dennis. Can I walk by him? Oh, well, she can.
So you do more internal.
A little bit more, and I'm doing it off the top of my head, which would be awful because it's trying to do deep point of view off the top of my head.
I did this at 3 a.m., so.
Damn. It was good. But yes, you don't need to know, oh, there's grandma. She's looking a little red. I wonder if she'd taken her.
Right.
I understand the temptation to, because you want to foreshadow everything.
Well, and you have to decide
you don't even
if
have
it really matters, because
right.
The reality is that's probably, hopefully that's not how she's doing it. But when you're walking down the aisle, you're not noticing everybody, 200 guests. You're not going to be aware of every single guest.
No, you'd be looking at probably, well, and then Dennis. And we might even just say, will he stand up when there's a reason to object?
Right. And the idea, like, even if her cousin Josie and the groom had an affair or had a one-night stand the night before, she doesn't know that. So,
or if she does, then that's...
Well, if she does, that's a whole other thing.
She's walking down the aisle wondering, would it be acceptable to stab the maid of honor? As she would be thinking something like that.
A pregnant pause, wondering if she's her cousin's pregnant by her soon-to-be husband.
Right.
Ugh.
Yes, you want to drop in little nuggets. And again, we talked about this last time when we were talking about where the story starts. It depends on the story.
Right.
And what the main focus is. Is the main focus that she's marrying someone and longing for Dennis, or is the main focus she's trying to make this work and he cheated on her?
Right. Very good.
And that she doesn't realize she's in love with the dentist. So
right.
It depends on how you're doing the story.
So
I think this is going to be a common theme in the series. It depends on how you're doing the story. But
well, and we're not trying to use that as our get out of jail card free.
No, I mean, all of these rules are meant to be broken if you know what you're doing. The key is though, to know. I mean, I have read books where they have info dumped and they've gotten away with it. But I prefer to weave it in so that you're not given the whole thing at the beginning, but like you keep a little bit of mystery through it.
Right.
A good example is that the book that I have out in August is
One Night in Provence. Oh, I'm not even saying it right. Provence. Sorry.
And the hero has had every single member of his family die. So he doesn't like commitment. And you hear at the beginning, he doesn't do commitment. He's a playboy. And then you slowly, he mentions that his father died on this vacation.
I see.
He mentions that his brother died of cancer. He mentions that his mother died a few months later.
All at different times.
All at different times in the book. He does not at one time explain that he lost every single family member.
And that's why I'm a playboy.
Right.
Right.
It, little drips and drabs. And then, later on even, something happens and he says, I wasn't there when my brother died. I wasn't there when my father died. I never was there when my mother died. I feel like I failed them all. But none of that comes out in one big dump.
Right. So what is let's say you're writing, how do you decide which pieces to keep? What parts of the information are needed in each scene?
I would say you want to do maybe one or two key pieces that you think are going to really be important in that scene. To use the
wow, I would never have thought of that, to kind of limit it.
Yeah.
That's a good way to do it.
You want to.
Then you have to pick the ones that are most prevalent that you need to have right in this moment.
Right. And when you first, most scenes you only need the very little bit of view. because you're going to get deeper and deeper as you go. And obviously the bottom of the iceberg is all the information and how it's impacting everything. And your reader's going to put together all the clues. You keep in mind that your reader is smart. And as you're dropping all these clues, they'll figure out, oh, that's why they have a fear of commitment. They don't really have to come right out and say, I have a fear of commitment or whatever. The problem is that we do all this research, so we want to share it all. Another time when we do info dumping is world building. It's the same thing. If you write an urban fantasy or a dystopian, you have this need. You're just like, well, I've created this world, so now I must tell everything about the world. And you don't have to. You can drop it in. Again, if they see a scene where she's on her racer and hits her communicator on her chest, you kind of get the vision of okay, it's future and she's racing around. You don't need to say, this was invented in such and such a year. And
Oh, that's a great example.
And another one would be time, like 6 months afterwards.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do have to do a little info dumping to catch someone up. Like it was 6 months later, we had been dating for, since that night and gotten progressively closer.
Rather than we don't have to go through the whole 6 months. Right.
Exactly.
The first date was pizza, the second date was a movie, etc.
Right. So you don't have to catch them up on everything off page. You want to just, again, pick those one or two key nuggets. And you may not know those until you info dump. We talked last time about throat clearing. That's what throat clearing is. Sometimes you have to get all the information out on page. And then you realize, okay, a lot of this stuff I don't need to tell until later.
Right.
You have to ask yourself, what pieces of information are important now?
Well, that's a good point because, as you know, I love analogies. Mm-hmm. I think it's analogy. Is that what I do well?
You do a lot of metaphors and analogies.
I'm sorry, metaphor.
Analogies, too. You do those well. Yeah.
But a lot of times I will put in every single one I want. And then I'll take a vote. And there are three of you, and the three of you will say, well, we all like these two.
Right.
And I'll try to say, well, what about the third or the fourth or the sixth? And you'll say, no, you really don't need all those.
Exactly.
But I can't tell in the heat of the moment which one is the best. So I have to write them all.
Yes.
But then afterwards, when you guys narrow it down, I generally can see why you picked them. And then the next time I'm writing and doing the same thing, I often can sort of suspect which ones you're going to choose, but I still like to put them in.
Yeah.
Just because it makes me feel better. It kind of releases it out of my body. So for me, I need to put all of that in.
As long as you feel better at the end, that's all that matters.
Well, it allows me to keep going forward. Whereas if I feel stuck because I didn't let it all out. So for me, I think info dumping is helpful in that one area. Yep. Other than that, I think most other things I forget to do. Sometimes, I forget to set them.
Well, and I think it depends on the genre.
Yeah.
I think you can get away with a little bit more in science fiction. You do tend to.
Well, you have to.
I don't read a lot of science fiction, but my brother does, and he tends to do a lot of info dumping about the technology when he writes his. And I think that if your readers want that,
right,
then you need to do it. My rule has always been the character's point of view. Would they share this kind of information?
Right.
Like if you've created a character who's closed off, then you're going to keep the information closed off as well. And they probably aren't self-aware, and they're probably not thinking, I can't get close to her because,
Right, but what does your reader want? You're right. The science fiction people probably like the technology. I know romance people like to hear how, handsome they are.
But you can go overboard with that too. Like you can just over-describe somebody because they look like Antonio Banderas. And you don't have to go through every detail. You can just talk about his,
Then his third row of abdominal muscles.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you can talk about his,
thick.
Lyrical Spanish accent and his thick wavy hair is probably,
enough.
And
well, we haven't got into his chest yet.
Well, that's it. They will go so overboard in describing what he looks like.
But I think a lot of, maybe not all of them.
Maybe the thing is, the tattoo on his shoulder,
is
the important thing. Like when I look at you, I'm not going to say, oh, well, he's got this baseball cap on and then piercing blue eyes. And, you're just going to
start with classically handsome and
move on. Right.
I don't think baseball cap and classically handsome go together, but
When the baseball cap's on my dome, it does.
When a baseball hat's on a classically handsome man, yes, it works.
But I think that's a really good point. I've kind of distracted my own self.
I mean, just because you know it doesn't mean, there's the opposite. You could you think because you know it so well that the reader doesn't need to know it. So I think that
exactly
we tend to compensate.
Yes.
But I have noticed a trend with a lot of, especially beginning writers, although even experienced writers do it. You tend to just dump as much information as possible, and you don't go back and cut it because you think it's important. And sometimes you have to be a little bit harsh with what you cut out.
Well, with Shelley and Mandra, a lot of times this happened. Our past meeting, Mandra had written a scene, and then she had taken our notes, and she came back and she edited, and she really thought she had nailed it. And as we kept kind of questioning her and telling her this was our impression from this scene, and she was kind of defending what she wrote. And then as she was talking, I wrote down everything she said, and then I held it up. I said, none of what you just said out loud is written on the page, and that's what you need to do. And she said, well, I thought it's in there. No, just because you know that's what happened, you didn't put it in there. So that's the opposite of info dumping.
That's the opposite. But then we go, so we'll overcompensate and say,
with
well, I need to
explain
why she's scared to go in.
Yes.
She saw a bee and she jumped because when she was 5, she stepped on a bee's nest and she didn't move and she got 55 bee stings. And from that day forward, she's been terrified of bees. Well, we don't need that little part of it. We just,
Right.
So that I think is the key lesson here. Less is more.
Less is more.
Less is
but
more.
Less of the right thing. That's the key. You have to find the right thing.
Yep.
Well, hopefully this info dumping has helped you. If you want to hear this episode again or share it with a friend, send them to the UnitedPodcastNetwork.tv. That's UnitedPodcastNetwork.tv. You can find this podcast and the vodcast video on demand in case you want to watch us. Find this episode and all previous episodes on UnitedPodcastNetwork.tv, and please subscribe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Café, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.